I've kept the design of this coat fairly basic because I want this to be as easy to make as a fur coat gets. I'm Ali and I've been making my own fake fur coats since the 90s and I just absolutely love them. It's a lot easier to make than you would think. So as long as you know how to sew the fur, how to cut it out to avoid just getting fluff everywhere, the actual sewing up of this is really simple. So it's just got a basic collar with a little bit of a stand to it. It is fully lined. I've used a contrast colour. I love this rust and the green together. It just looks really autumnal. And what I've done is I've just sewn the lining exactly the same size as the fur. I don't want to have a facing of fur inside the centre front and on the hems because it's just going to make it more bulky. And likewise on the collar I've used a satin underneath because it means that it's not too bulky. When you wear a fur coat and the collar has the fur underneath as well, and I've made them like this, I just find that it gets so bulky, so I've kept it really simple. So it doesn't have any buttons, it has these fur hooks, and this just makes it so much easier to do up and a lot easier to make. You don't have to deal with buttonholes in this furry fabric. I've not put any pockets on the outside because it is tricky to put pockets in fur like this, and I wanted to keep it simple, and I've just put a small, very basic inside pocket inside this because I don't like going out with a coat with no pockets at all, because sometimes if you're not carrying a bag you want something. So you don't need an awful lot of fur to make this. Now I felt like I made this for a bargain price because I've made it out of just over 1 metre of fur, and the same for the lining. So it doesn't have to cost a fortune. Even if you find a fur that's pretty expensive, you're not going to need much of it. So this fur fabric was just under 1.5 metres wide, and I had about 1.25 metres of fabric. Now I am quite short, so you might want a bit more. And if I just kind of stand on tiptoes, because I think it was right at the bottom of the screen, it only comes to here, but you can adapt this pattern to whatever length you want. So I make this from my coat block and my 2-piece sleeve pattern, and there's hardly any adaptations at all. It's pretty much as the block comes. I've just added a little bit of ease to the body because I like things like fur coats to be nice and loose. I don't want them to be really fitted, and I've added some ease to the sleeves as well because I just wanted this to be a nice, comfy, loose coat. So going back to the collar, it's really basic. It's just got this contrast fabric underneath, and it's just one piece, and there's not even any measurements to take to make this. It's just traced off from the pattern, and I'll show you how to shape that collar so you get that little bit of stand so it sits up on your neck rather than completely flat. So you don't need to take any measurements. If you've got your block and it fits well, just think about how much extra ease you might want to add in. If you want to adjust the neck size a little bit, I wanted it nice and snug around my neck, and I've just dropped it a little bit at the front. I will explain that when I do the pattern in a minute. So I've just added a little bit of ease. I've added a couple of centimetres all the way around, both on the body and the sleeve, and I've shortened the body a little bit from the length of my block and just kept the sleeves the same. So just have a think about those things, but you don't need to take any measurements at all. It's really quick to do the pattern for this. So I don't want to keep talking because we've got plenty to go through, so let's just get on now and I will show you how I made the pattern from my block for this coat. So I've traced off my coat block. This is exactly as it is in my coat block tutorial, and what I've done is I've put my sample on and just decided how much extra ease I want to add and how much shorter I want my coat to be than the block. So the first thing I'm going to do is just shorten the length a little bit. So I'm just going to draw a line where my length is. So this is the hip line from my block, and I'm just measuring up 10.5 centimetres, and that's going to be the hem position of my finished coat. So I'm just going to do that to indicate I no longer need that line. So I've just turned this around and zoomed in a little bit so you can see better what I'm doing on the side seam. So if I just bring this up a little bit here, the side seam here, I want to add a little bit of ease. And I'm going to get rid of the waist shaping as well. So I want to add in 0.5 centimetre on the front and on the back. That's going to give me 2 centimetres in total. And all I'm doing is measuring at the hem point and at the armhole here, and I'm just going to join that with a straight line. I don't want any waist shaping in this because it's not a fitted kind of jacket. It's kind of pointless doing it fitted if it's made out of a fluffy fur. So that's all I need to do for that, and then just rub out the previous line, and I'm just going to do exactly the same on the back. So that's the side seam adjusted now, front and back. So I've just got that little bit of extra ease, and I've got rid of the waist shaping. And the other thing I'm going to do, just to make this armhole a good shape, it's made it slightly odd shape because I've brought it out, is I'm just lowering it by 0.5 centimetre, and that maintains the nice shape of it, and it also just gives me that little bit extra ease.
So I'm just doing that on the front and the back. And then obviously what I'm going to have to do, if you haven't already drafted a sleeve, that's fine because you can work from this armhole. But if you already have a sleeve that you've drafted from your coat block, it's really easy just to amend the inner sleeve to take that into account. And then the only other adjustments I want to do on here is I'm going to just lower my front neck a little bit, just because I don't want it to feel too tight on the front neck when it's done up. So I'm lowering that by 3/4 centimetre and just reshaping this. I'm keeping the width exactly as it is. So that's the neck done. And then the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to move the dart. I don't want my dart going there. I'm going to have a small dart going over to the side seam. So what I'm going to do initially, I'm going to have that at a slight angle. I'm just drawing in the position to this bust point. So I need to cut this out before I can move the dart, but before I cut it out, I need to just have an overlap at the front. So I'm going to be doing this up with hooks. I don't need to worry about button size. I just need to think about how much overlap I want on this. And I'm going to add 2 centimetres to this. So if I draw, let's just draw a little bit of this in. If I draw that there and then I draw 2 centimetres the other side of this, because that's going to be where both of my edges are when this crosses over. I hope that makes sense. It's a big enough overlap. I don't want to go really much bigger than that because it will get bulky with 2 layers of fur, but any smaller than that, you're going to risk when you move it kind of pulling open and gaping. So you wouldn't want that either. So I'll just get rid of this little line here and I'm just going to do a few points on here, 2 centimetres, so I can draw that line. And I'm not going to add a seam allowance to this pattern. I'm going to add my seam allowance as I'm cutting it out. If you want to add a seam allowance, that's absolutely fine, but I'm not going to for this pattern. So that's now ready to cut out. I just need to extend that across there. And it's already extended at the front. So let's just turn this around and zoom out a little bit again. So that's basically the front and the back. So I need to move that dart now. That's the last bit I need to do. So what I'm going to do is just get both of these pieces cut out and then I can get that dart moved. And then I'm ready to move on to the sleeve and just get the collar drawn up. I've got both of those now cut out and I just quickly need to amend my hem here. So when I line these up, it goes to a little bit of a point, which I don't want. So all I'm going to do is just shave off the tiniest little bit on that bit there. And that's just going to make sure that my hem doesn't have that little point at the side. So the more difference you have between the width at the top and the bottom, the more of a point it will go to. So you can see straight away, it just makes that a nice straight hem. So the last thing I need to do, my back is now done, that's complete. The last thing I need to do on the front is I just need to move this dart. So all I'm going to do is just cut up where I want my dart to be up to that bust point. And then I'm just going to cut up the side of the original dart. And then when I close it up, I'm going to have my dart in the new position. And it really is as simple as that. And then I'll just show you how to finish off your pattern to make it complete. All I need to do is just stick some paper behind here and then finish off the dart. So I'm just going to tape that on from the back. And now all I need to do, let's turn it the right way up, is I need to just move this point. I don't want my dart going all the way to the bust point. So I'm just going to finish my dart off here. And I'm going to just draw in the new lines. So if you want to trace this off to make it a little bit less confusing, then you can do that. But otherwise, as long as you make sure it's nice and clear, and what I tend to do is just draw an arrow to the actual line that I'm using, and it saves me tracing off the whole pattern. So the last bit I need to do for my dart is just to finish off this side seam, which I just need to continue that line down here, and then I just need to find the midpoint of my dart, which is here. So I'll just extend that over to that and then just join those 2 points. And that just means that when my dart is sewn up, the side seam will be straight. So I'm just going to stick this down much better now that I've drawn everything. And I can now just cut this out, and I'll cut all of the excess off the back just to neaten this up. And I just obviously need to label my pattern pieces. So that's the body pieces done. All I've done is I've lowered my neck, I've moved my dart, and I've added a little bit of ease on the side, and then obviously the overlap at the front and the length. So I can put those aside now and do the sleeves. So I have traced off the outer part of my two-piece sleeve pattern that fits that block. And I don't need to do anything to this. I've not changed anything on my pattern that means I need to change this, and I'm not changing the length or anything, so I can leave that as it is. But I am having to change the inner piece a little bit just because of the adjustments on the pattern. So on my body part, I added a little bit of ease and I lowered the armhole a bit. So I am going to do those adjustments while I'm tracing this off, just to save me having to cut my pattern and stick it all back together again. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut the outer one out because I don't need that to be attached, and then we can just look at the inner sleeve. So let's have a look at this inner sleeve. If I just go back to my block, what I'm talking about is where I added the ease in here on both the front and the back, and I lowered this by 0.5 centimetre. So what I'm going to do is where my side seam point is here, I want to draw a line all the way down, and I'm going to line it up with my dot and cross. So if I just turn that around, I can line it up much easier. If you don't have dot and cross, then you need to just basically draw a line down from your balance point to the hem, and it's going to be at that kind of angle, but to be honest, if it's off a little bit, it doesn't really matter. So I am going to use this guideline for tracing this off. So I'm going to draw a line on my new bit of paper, and I added a 0.5 centimetre ease on both the front and the back on my pattern. So if we add the ease that I added in for the front and the back, it's 1 centimetre. So I am just going to draw another line 1 centimetre from my original line. So that is basically, you don't have to do it this way, but I think it's the easiest way to explain. So this is basically the ease that I have added in. So if I put my pieces here, if you look at where the original line is and where the new line is, hopefully you can see that. But basically this little bit here is for what I've added on. And now what I need to do is I need to trace off both sides of this pattern. So I'm going to line it up with the dot and cross because it just makes it that little bit easier. So I'm just going to line up to that point there with the line that I've drawn on my sleeve and make sure it joins on at the back as well. And I just need to trace around this. So I've not traced around that brilliantly, but I know where the line is and I can neaten that up in a second. And then all I need to do, whereas I lined it up with that piece, I'm now going to line it up with this piece. And I'm going to do exactly the same on this side. So I've traced off the other side. You can probably hardly see that because I've not traced it off brilliantly. But let's just look at the top. I've traced off both sides. So let's zoom in so you can see it a bit better. And I'll draw this on a bit heavier in a second because I also need to lower this the same as what I lowered on my pattern. You can't adjust the pattern on the body piece but not the sleeve. So all I'm doing is lowering that. And now, and this is why I didn't trace it off too heavy, I need to just join that up with the original line from my sleeve pattern. And I'll do exactly the same on this side. And you can see as well that's a better shape. Had I not lowered it, it would have gone very straight there. So I've done that bit, and then at the bottom as well, this doesn't line up. So I just need to redraw that curve in there. So I've got both my end points, and I am just going to draw across there with a little bit of a curve because where I opened it up, it ended up just making that hem a little bit messy. And then the last thing I need to do is just draw these lines in a little bit better. I didn't trace it off particularly neatly, but I can just draw those in. And I have no reason to keep these lines in the middle. I don't need those now, and they're only going to cause confusion in the future. If I was to get this pattern out, I might wonder why I have them there. So I'm just taking those off. So I'm just going to finish drawing this in, and then I'm going to get this cut out, and all we've got left to do is the collar. And then I nearly forgot, in the centre of these two lines, you need to just put your balance point back in. That's what's going to line up with the side seam. So this is what I have now. I've got my back and front, and I've got the 2 pieces for the sleeve, and I've just written on all of them. So I've written NSA on all of these because they don't have a seam allowance, so it just stands for no seam allowance. If you're putting a seam allowance on, obviously you don't need to do that. But one difference with this, if I can zoom out a little bit more, you can see them better, is if I was making, say, a wool coat, I would have facings on this. I would have a hem coming up onto the inside and the lining a bit shorter on the inside. Because I'm making this out of fur, I'm actually cutting the lining and the outer exactly the same. And the reason for this is because if I have a facing in the fur, if I have a hem coming up, like quite thick in the fur, it's going to make my edges incredibly bulky. And because the pile on the fur kind of overlaps at the bottom and at the edges, you're not going to see the lining. You don't have to do it like that. You can do it the way you would do a standard kind of coat. But I want this to feel really nice when I wear it. And if I'm adding any bulk with facings and hems and stuff like that, it's not going to feel so nice. I'm also going to do a fairly small seam because I don't want big bulky seams. So I'm just going to cut this out with 1 centimetre. So I have all of these pieces now done. I can't cut my fur on the fold. It's going to be impossible. So what I'm going to do for the back is I'm just going to trace this off exactly the same and just stick it to the other side so I have the complete back piece. These ones, I'm just going to cut them out one at a time. I'll cut, for example, this outer sleeve. I'm just going to cut one out like this, and I'll flip it over and cut the other one like that. Just make sure you do mirror images of those. So I'm going to put my sleeve pattern aside now. The last bit I need to do is my collar, and this is a really nice, easy, basic collar to draft.
So let's just have a closer look at the collar. I obviously talked about it before, but let's look in more detail. So basically, you'll see when I make the pattern in a second that I trace off the back and the front, and then I have to reduce this outer edge here. And I'll do that by adjusting the pattern. And by doing that, it makes this outside edge a little bit smaller. So it won't be able to sit exactly where you traced it off, but it will bring it up a little bit. And that's what gives this collar a little bit of a stand at the neck. And that's why it's nicely going up on my neck and then sitting down. If you don't do that overlap, your collar will just be completely flat to your coat, which you can do if that's what you want. That's called a Peter Pan collar. But if you want it like mine, where it just sits nice and snug on your neck and then going down, this is the way to cut the pattern for it. It's really simple. Again, no measurements to take. It is just a case of tracing things off and doing a few little overlaps to make this collar. And just have a little think about the shape that you want. You just need to think how much you want this cut out. You could have it quite long and pointy, you could have it really wide, and you can have the depth of your collar however you want it. I probably wouldn't go much smaller than this for a fur coat, but you could have a really big collar. You could really play around with this. So let's just go through now a bit at a time how I made the pattern for the collar.
So I don't need to do calculations for this. I'm literally going to trace from my pattern. So I'm going to trace the back off and just make sure the depth of your collar, you've got enough paper there to cover it. So I'm going to do this bigger than I need it, just so I've got plenty. And all I'm doing to start with is I'm literally just tracing around this. And that's all I need, is just the centre back, the neck and the shoulder. And then I've just drawn a little bit down here, and I'm going to measure a point 2 centimetres down. Now this isn't going to be an exact science because everyone's size is going to be slightly different, but 2 centimetres is a pretty good idea. You're going to have to make a sample of your collar to make sure you're happy with it anyway. So what I'm doing now is I'm using the front part of my pattern. I'm not sure how well you can see this zoomed in. So I'm using the front there and I'm lining my shoulders up. But what I'm going to do is I'm using this point here because I want to overlap it. I need to keep it lined up on this neck edge, and I'm just going to swivel this round until this point here meets that part there. And as I said, it's not an exact amount that's going to work for everyone because everyone's shoulder width is different, everyone's proportions are different, but it's a good amount to get started. And then all you need to do is just trace around the front neck. And then I need to mark this point here, which is my centre front. Now I've already added my overlap on here, so I can't continue that line, but if I do that, all I need to do, I added 2 centimetres on that pattern, is just measure 2 centimetres from there, and then I can draw in that position. So hopefully this is making sense so far. The next thing I'm going to draw in is the depth of my collar. Now I'm not going to draw it massive, but I don't want to go too small because with the bulk of the fur, if you've got a tiny collar, it's just going to look funny. So I'm just going to draw this in 10 centimetres, and all I'm doing is measuring from the neck opening around in several places, and then I can just join all of those with a line. So that's the back done, and I'm just going to do exactly the same at the front. It's very easy to forget which is the front and the back, so I've just marked the back there. So don't worry about the shape of it at the moment. All I'm doing is following that neck, and once you draw it out, it looks more exaggerated. But I'm going to sort that out in a minute because I've got other little amendments that I need to do. So this is the front. So if I draw that like that, this is the front neck coming round here, and then this is the centre front here. So it's going to overlap, but I don't want my collar to overlap. I want it to meet at the centre front point there. Let's just zoom in a little bit so you can see it better. So what I'm going to end up with, let's just draw a little picture here, is my coat's going to overlap. So if I draw a dotted line, that's where the underneath bit is. And then my collar is going to come like this. It's a very, very standard kind of collar. So I need to draw that shape in here. And as I said, you're going to have to make a sample to make sure you're happy with it. But all you need is that kind of shape there. You can do it slightly rounded if you want, but I'm just going to draw that straight for now. And then the next thing I need to do is I need to draw in the shape. I don't want it curving up like this. So I'm just going to pick a point from about there and just join that. So you can see now it's starting to look more like a collar. So let's just rub that out and rub that out. And you can see that's now looking better. And the last thing I'm going to do, I'm going to just bring that over a little bit like that, just to make that a better shape. So that is the beginnings of the collar now. So that is the shoulder line, that's the front, and that's the back. If I leave it like this, it's going to be a very, very flat collar. It's just going to fit flat to my body. I want it to have a little bit of shape around the neck, and it's really easy to do that. So to avoid it getting really confusing with lots of lines, I'm just going to cut this out exactly as it is, and then I will do my amendments, and then I'm going to trace it off once I have completed it. So that is the basic shape. So if you imagine, that's the back, that goes over the shoulder, and that is the front of the collar. That hopefully makes a little bit more sense now. But to get that nice shaping around the neck, what I need to do is I need to add some shape to my collar. And by overlapping a few little sections, so basically I'm kind of doing this, I'm making this outer bit a little bit smaller, but keeping this the same, it gives it that shape. So I'm going to rub this original line here out to avoid any confusion. And then what I want to do is draw 5 lines on here. So I'm going to go with 1 at the centre and then on either side. This doesn't need to be exact. It's not going to make much difference. So just do this by eye. You just want 5 lines, 1 in the middle and then 2 on either side of those bits. And then each of these at the bottom, just measure a point 3/4 of a centimetre or 7.5 millimetres from the original line. And then all we're going to do is we're going to overlap our pattern. So if I show you on this one, I'm just cutting up there and then I'm just overlapping that to where this point is here and then sticking it back down. And that's going to help give this some shape. So I'll get these other 4 done and then we can have a look at what we have. And this is how it now looks. So this neck edge hasn't changed size. That's going to join onto my pattern perfectly. But because this side now is a little bit shorter when you go around the edge, it's going to lift it up on the shoulder, which will automatically create a little bit of a stand on the collar and give it more shape. So I've got this weird shape here and I need to sort that out, but I need to trace the whole thing off. So I'm just going to, when I trace it off, just trace that a better shape, and I can add a little bit of a curve to this bit as well. And what I need to do, again, like the back, I can't cut this on the fold that I might do if it was a different fabric. I'm going to trace it and then I'll flip it over and trace it again so I have the whole collar and I can cut it out in one piece. So all I've done for this is I've just drawn this line where the centre back is, I've traced around it, and then I've just played around with these to make it a better shape. So if we look at that, where this, if I put it on there you can see it better, it's gone all wiggly. I've just laid it on there and just smoothed it out and made it a much better shape. So all I need to do now is I'm going to just fold this over where the centre back is, and I can just cut this out all in one piece. To make sure that nothing slips, because I don't want a wonky collar, all I'm going to do is just put a couple of pins through it to make sure both layers are held in place. So I can just get that cut out now, and that's my collar done. And that's how it looks now it's cut out. So once it's on the body, this is how it's going to look. So that's the collar now done. What you just need to check is where you did it on the fold, that this is nice and straight at the back. You don't want that going to a point or coming in this way on either side. So that's done. I can now start getting everything cut out.
So hopefully you found that nice and straightforward. There's not much to do, as I said, but what you do need to do, you're not going to be able to cut this fur out with your fabric on the fold like you would with other fabrics. So you just need to flip your pattern pieces over for the two bits on the back, the collar and the main back piece here. So you can cut those out in one piece. All of the other pieces are no problem. You'll just cut one and then flip it over and cut the other. So it's just really essential you cut one piece at a time.
So in case it wasn't obvious what I meant when I said I was going to trace off the back and flip it over, I've just done this all in one piece, so I don't have to cut it on the fold. And I've made sure I've put my balance point on the back as well. And that just is going to make it so much easier to cut out. So as I said, all of my pieces are the same for the lining as they are for the fur. So I just need to, on the lining I can do it on the fold, but for the fur I need to do each piece one on each side, and obviously just one piece for the back. And then for my collar, I'm not going to use the fur for the under collar because it makes it less bulky, so I just need to cut one piece out like this. And then the last thing I'm going to cut out is a little bit of interfacing. So you don't have to do this because obviously fur is pretty thick, but because it's knitted, I don't want it to over time stretch across the shoulders and on the neck where my collar is going. So all I've done is I've just traced off these two little pattern pieces to put a bit of interfacing around the top. So I've literally just traced around the edge, and then I've just drawn this line here. So if I put it up there, you can see it, and there's the back. So it's just giving a little bit more structure to the shoulder and the neck. And I'm just going to use a medium weight cotton to do that. I'm not using a heavy interfacing because I don't need it for this kind of structure. And then if you want to, you could put a bit down your centre front as well, but I'm not going to do that. I feel like there's enough structure in this fur. So it's just that bit I'm going to do. And I'm also going to cut it out for the collar just to give that a little bit more structure too.
So let's just get everything cut out now. I need to cut a piece of everything for my fur. I need to do the same for my lining. It's exactly the same, but not the collar, because I'm using this different fabric for the underside of my collar. So just have a think about what fabrics you want to use. And of course, if you want fur on your under collar, then just cut that out of fur as well. There's so many different variations of what you could do with this coat. I'll show you now how to cut this out to be able to get this absolutely perfect and not create loads of fluff that you're going to breathe in. Now, I didn't wear a mask when I cut this out, and I have had a little bit of a tickly throat because I think some of those little fibres I probably breathed in. So if you have got a sensitive throat, I really would just put a mask over your face. It sounds a bit over the top, but these little fibres are a bit of a pain. And if you ever went to a factory where they're making things like this, they would be wearing some kind of mask. So let's just go through now the best way of pinning out the pattern pieces, which way the pile goes, and how to cut everything out, all of those kind of things.
So this is the fur that I'm using. What you don't want to do is you don't want to be pinning stuff on this side. For starters, you're gonna struggle. Let's get one of the pieces. You're gonna struggle to pin it on this side because it is gonna slip around like crazy. You need to work from the wrong side. And the same with the cutting. If I was just to cut through here, if I just cut this edge off, you'll see straight away I end up with all this fluff, and that is going to be a nightmare. You're going to breathe it all in. It's going to go everywhere. You're going to have to do a lot of vacuuming. So let's just get rid of all these little bits of fluff. And what you want to be doing is you want to be cutting through the back, and just cut it really slowly. It's quite a laborious task, but if you cut it from the back like this, and you just want to literally try and get through this layer. Fur fabrics like this, I don't know if they're always knitted, but generally they're knitted. You need to just cut through the bit that you can see that's knitted. And if it's a different colour on yours as it is on mine, it does make it that little bit easier. And by doing that, it should then just separate, and you're not going to end up with loads of fibres. You're going to get a few, but that's nowhere near as many as when I cut that little bit at the front. So this is what I need to do now. I need to, let's get rid of all that fluff. I need to get all my pieces cut out. So I'm going to take my time playing around with how I'm going to lay them out, because I don't have much fur. This is the last bit they had in the shop, so I'm having to be really careful. But you just want to pin through this layer, so you're literally just going through a tiny little bit, and then I've not got a seam allowance. All I'm going to do is take my time with my ruler, cutting a bit like that. And if you want to, you could draw a line on as well with your ruler. There's various ways of doing it, but basically I need to just cut all of my pieces out 1 centimetre around what I've got, and I'm doing the same for the hems as well. I don't want any bulk added to this. And then the last thing you really need to make sure you do is make sure your pile's going the correct way. So as you stroke it, you will know if it feels right. If I go the opposite way, you can see it changes colour and it doesn't feel right. You want that to go down. So make sure all of your pattern pieces are the correct way up, so the pile goes down on your pattern pieces towards the hem. And then for the collar, because this is cut in one piece, it's going to be a little bit more tricky. So I've accidentally turned that around now. So my pile goes that way, and I want the bottom of the back of my collar to run with that. And I am going to have the front, it's going to be just very slightly off because I don't want to put any joins in this. I can't line the front up to go the correct way around because obviously it doesn't work when it's cut in one piece. So if we line up the centre of it to work like that, then our fur will work around it. So that is basically how you do the collar. So just really take your time. You don't want to be getting it wrong. I'm going to get all of these bits cut out now, and I'm going to cut out all of my lining pieces as well, and then I will carry on filming once I've got that done. I've got a feeling this is going to take me an hour or two, and you really don't want to watch me do it. So the only piece where I've got a dart to mark is on my front piece. So this is all cut out now with the 1 centimetre. And then you can either do a stitch or you can mark it with a pin. You can do snips at the side if you want to, but I don't really want to be snipping this fabric. But for now, all I'm going to do is I'm just going to put a pin in each of these. And that's enough to mark these. If you think they're likely to fall out, then I would put a stitch in there and a contrast thread. So that's all I need for those. But before I take off my paper, I need to mark the end of my dart. So all I'm going to do is push a pin through the end there. And then let's just quickly take out all of these pins. And then all I need to do is just, before I take this off, just peel it back. And hopefully you can see enough detail. Let's see if I can zoom in a bit better. And where that pin goes through the fabric, just use a second pin to go through there. And just mark it like that, and then that can come out, and that's your dart marked. So I'll show you what to do for sewing this up in a minute, but as long as you've got that marked, then that's absolutely fine. Oh, I need to zoom back out, don't I? And then for your second piece, obviously flip it over and do exactly the same on the reverse. And where your dart is, if you can't see it through the paper, just mark it on this side as well. I'm starting to get a lot of fluff in here now. I'm vacuuming as I go, but it's still everywhere. So this is one of my inner sleeves. And what I'm doing before I take this one off again is just marking that notch with a pin. That's all I need to do, and then I can flip it over and cut the other one out. Right, so that's all the fur cut out. It took me quite a while. I would say that took me well over an hour just to cut these out, because I was being so careful to cut from this side and not cut through all the pile. It still created a lot of fluff, but I can't even imagine how much it would have created had I not been really careful doing that. So I've got all these parts marked where the notches are and stuff. I could replace those with a stitch, but the pins are staying in absolutely fine. So I'm going to put all of these aside. I'm going to give them another little shake just to make sure any of these bits come off, because the more I can get off now, the less messy it's going to be when I sew it. So I'm going to put these aside, and then what I need to do is cut exactly the same out of my lining, and I'm going to stick with a 1 centimetre seam allowance on that as well, because if not, it's just going to get really confusing. So I've got two different linings. I've got this green, which I just really love with this rust colour. It just looks really autumnal, something really nice about it. And you're not going to see this, it's just that nice little contrast on the inside. But from the underside of my collar, if it flaps up in the wind, I didn't want that visible. And I quite liked this gold. This is a bit of fabric that I just happen to have, but it works perfectly, I think, with that. You're only going to see a tiny hint of it if that collar flaps up, and I just thought that was a really nice fabric. So I just need to cut everything out of these fabrics. So my collar, I just need to cut one piece. I can either just cut it with the pattern open. What have I done with my pattern? I can either just cut it like this, or I can fold my pattern in half and just cut this on the fold. I'm going to add a centimetre seam allowance, exactly the same as the rest. And then all of my body pieces, my sleeve, I'm just going to cut out of the green, and I'm just going to do all of this on the fold. I'm going to just fold my back piece in half, or at this stage I could cut it down, but if I plan on making it again, I want to keep it as a whole. So I'm just going to fold it like this, and I can get that cut on the fold. So just make sure you mark all your notches as well. So I'll go and get all of those cut out, and then we will finally be ready to start putting this together. So that's my collar cut out, just one piece on the fold for the under fabric, which is in this contrast. And I did say a centimetre all round, but actually what I should have said was 1/2 centimetre on this outside edge. And you'll see why in a minute, but basically it's when you fold it over, when you imagine it's on your body like that, you don't want the underneath fabric bulking up, you just want that to be slightly smaller. So I've just taken 1/2 centimetre off on this side. It's got a centimetre on the fur layer and just 1/2 centimetre on this one.
So everything's cut out. It took a while, but I'm ready now to start sewing it up. And I think it's probably going to be just as quick to sew it up as it was to cut it out, because I really took my time. So we're going to start off by putting the interfacing in. So if you're not adding interfacing, then you can just skip through that bit. And then we're going to just start assembling it. It's got this little dart at the side here, which you can't even see. And then it's just a case of doing the sides and the shoulders, putting your sleeve together, and then you really just have to put the sleeves in and the collar on, and your coat is pretty much put together. It's just finished off at the end by putting the lining in. So let's get started by putting that interfacing in first, and then I'll go through step by step of everything you need to do to get this sewn up, and I'll show you tips on how to sew it along the way. So when you're working with a really bulky fabric like this fur, you don't need to add interfacing for structure as such, because it's already pretty heavy. But what I have done on my coat is, because I wear my coats for years, I don't want it to lose shape, and the fur is knitted, so it could stretch a little bit over time. So all I've done is use a medium weight cotton, and I've just put a little bit of interfacing around the neck and the shoulder, just to give it a bit of structure where the collar sews on, and a little bit of structure across the shoulder so that doesn't stretch down. And then I've also put some in my collar just to give it that little bit more shape. So if you've got a really heavy fur, you might not want to add that in. Or if yours is more lightweight, you might want to add something a little bit more stiff. But if you want to be adding it in for your coat, then just follow this for the pattern for the interfacing, and I'll show you how to put it in as well.
So that's all those bits cut out. So for the front and back pieces, I've not put an extra bit of seam allowance at the bottom because it's just going to be that cut edge, and I've just added the seam allowance around the rest. I've done both of those, so 2 pieces for the front and 1 piece on the fold for the back, and then I've just cut a piece out for the collar with the seam allowance all the way around, and it's just on the fold on the centre back. So all I need to do with these pieces is I'm just pinning them all on first. So that's the fronts on there, the back goes on like that. It should be pretty self-explanatory. And then the collar goes on like that. And then I'm just gonna hand stitch these on. So I'm just gonna do a running stitch around the collar, and then I'll put a few stitches in here. Because you've got all of that pile, you can get away with doing those stitches quite easily. So if you've ever looked at a proper tailored jacket being made, they do little tiny stitches in rows on all of these kind of bits of reinforcement. You don't need to worry so much about that. This fabric, because of the pile, if you were to even do quite a big stitch, you're not going to see it. So all I'm going to do is just start by doing my stitch around the edge, and then I'll just put a few other little bits in place to hold this in place on all of these pieces. So basically all I'm doing, if I just kind of start it off here, I've just got a single thread, I've not doubled it over, and I'm just gonna, if I go around here, just do a little stitch every now and then just to hold that in place. And I'm just going through, if I show you on here, I'm just going through a little bit like that. You're never in a million years going to see that from the other side. So I'll get that sewn on and show you how it looks once I've finished it. So that's the first one done. So as I said, you don't need to do loads and loads of rows. This is not a tailored jacket where you need all that perfect structure. You just need this little bit at the top to give it some kind of structure. You don't have to put this in, but it means when you put your collar on, when you do your shoulders, and the shoulder obviously takes the weight of the sleeve, it just means you're going to have that little bit more structure to it to avoid it stretching. So that's the first one done. Obviously make sure you can't see it from the other side. You'd have to go pretty far through to see it. So I'm just going to get all of the other bits like this now sewn on. So that's all my little pieces of cotton now sewn on to give this some structure.
If you've got one, a walking foot like this is going to make it a lot easier to sew the fur. So my machine came with this, and I think a lot of machines do. If your machine didn't come with a walking foot, you can buy a walking foot that fits most machines. So I would have a look into doing that. You don't have to, but it just makes it that bit easier. So if you use a regular foot, your fabric is fed through with the little feeders from underneath. If you use one of these, and I will show you in a lot more detail in a minute, you have some extra bits that come down and it feeds it from the top as well. So rather than your fabric feeding from the bottom and then just kind of pulling along on the top, you're feeding it from both sides, and it stops the slippage, because when you put the two right sides together with your fur, the pile is pushing against each other, and it's very easy for that to slip and make the sewing quite tricky. So if you have got one of these, or you can get one, I would absolutely recommend it for making your sewing a lot easier. And then the other thing you really need to do before you get started is just play around with your stitch length, tension, all of those things. So you need a nice strong needle. You could use a ballpoint needle as well, as this is a knitted fabric, but don't go for something really delicate because you've got a lot to sew through. You need to make sure the pressure on your foot is nice and heavy. I don't know if it's the same on all machines, but on mine I have this little dial here, and you can tighten that or loosen that, and that alters the pressure going down on the foot. So just have a little think about that as well, and play around with the stitch length. I used a 3.5 stitch length on this. You don't want to go too small with a bulky fabric like this. So just play around, make sure your tension's okay, and just do a few little samples. And you always want to sew with the pile. So the pile should be going downwards. You want to sew downwards. You don't want to be sewing up, because you're going to be sewing against that. Now, obviously, when you're doing things like shoulders, it's not so important because you're going across it. But things like going down the centre front here, going down the side seams, doing this sleeve, you always want to start at the top and go down to the bottom. It might make it easier if you tack it as you are sewing it, because that will stop it slipping as well. And rather than using pins, I use these little clips. These are well worth getting. I got these really cheap on Amazon, and you can clip the fabric together, which is much easier than pins when you're using something really bulky like this. So I'll show you everything you need to know now for clipping it together, sewing it up, all the machine settings, all of those things. And we're going to now put all of this fur together. And then once you've done that, sewing the lining is going to be an absolute breeze.
The first bit I'm going to sew up is the darts on the front. So I'm just going to put all these other bits aside for now. And let's have a look at this dart. So it's not ideal to be sewing a dart in fur, but I don't want a completely shapeless coat. So let's just zoom in a little bit so we can see it better. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to mark, if I turn that pin this way, I'm just lining the ruler up with that pin and this one. And then I'm just going to put a few in. I'll try and pick out colours that are going to stand out against this fur so you can see it. So that's basically the side of my dart. And I'll do exactly the same on this other side. So this is the actual stitch line. I don't want to end up, once I've done my dart, with all this bulk like this. So I'm actually going to trim this off a little bit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut it 1 centimetre from either of these lines until I get to the point here where I can't trim it anymore. So the point where this is 2 centimetres wide is around here. So I'm still going to need to keep a little bit of bulk there, but I can get rid of a lot of this by just literally cutting 1 centimetre from that dart sewing line. So I'll get this cut on both sides up to the point where I reach this point here where I know I can't trim anymore. It doesn't look like much, but it means I've got that much less bulk in there, and then I can just pull a lot of this fluff out as well. And you shouldn't even see this dart once it's sewn up. So this bit now is nice and easy. I can just line it up like that, and then once I fold it, I can just complete the last bit up to that point. So I'm just going to get my other piece cut exactly the same, and then we can start sewing these up. So that's both of my darts now ready to start sewing up. So let's just concentrate on one. So when I'm sewing up this fur, what I don't want is to get all of that pile all within the seam. I want to fold it back on itself like this. And the same on that side. And I can take these pins out now because I know that I've got a centimetre seam allowance at those points. I can take that out as well. So I just need to line these up. And you can pin them if you want, but I find when you've got really thick fabrics like this, these little clips I think I just bought these on eBay or Amazon. You can get them anywhere. They just make it that bit easier because you're not having to pin through all this thickness. So I'm just going to put plenty of these in to hold this in place. So once you get to that bit there, you just got to kind of poke the pile through. So if I turn it over, even before I've stitched it just with the clips in, you can't really see that it's there, and that's exactly what you want. So when I'm sewing it up, I always start from this side and go to the point. This is the bit that's going to be a bit more tricky. You need to kind of pull the fur out of the way from the other side. And I need to sew to this point here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a clip there just to kind of squash it down. And then I'm just trying not to get my hands in the way, just putting that pin across like that so I can see exactly where I need to stop by. And then these ones here, you're sewing such a tiny little amount that when you're sewing it, you can kind of, when you finish this bit here where you're doing the 1 centimetre, you can really just do this by eye to meet up with this pin. If you feel like it's going to be too tricky to do that, you can use a vanishing pen just to draw a line on here where you're going to stitch. But it shouldn't be too tricky because you're going to be able to line that up with the seam guide on your sewing machine up to that point, and then you've only got that little bit to go. And you can always put pins in as you're sewing it or something. But if in doubt, just get a vanishing pen, or to be honest, you could draw on this with anything. You're not going to see it once you've sewn it up. So that's how it's going to look. It will be completely hidden. If it looks that good just with those clips, you know when it's sewn up, it's going to be absolutely fine. And then we'll have a look at what we can do with this bulky bit once that's done. So this is how the walking foot looks close up. So it's a much chunkier foot, and then every machine's going to be different, but if I show you, I've got this little bit that then pulls down and it sits under there. So whereas when you sew with a regular foot, you've just got these feeders underneath that feed the fabric through. As I sew, what you'll see happen is this bit moves as well. I can't really do it without sewing, but I wonder if I can put it up and down. Yeah, so as I do that, you can see it moving, and it feeds the fabric from the top as well. And it just helps with really bulky fabrics like this, or things for pile, for the fabric not to separate and move around. So let's have a look at sewing this with a little scrap. So gonna get it in position first. Take that clip out now, and as I'm sewing, I'm just gonna make sure that fur all pokes in. So make sure your foot's in the down position. I'm going to set this on a fairly big stitch. You can't sew this with a small stitch, so I'm going to go with 3.5 and I'm going to see how it is with 3.5. So if you look at this bit here, you should see that now moving as I sew. So it's basically doing that kind of motion, and it's just feeding the fabric from the top as well. And it means this fur isn't going to slide around, because when you've got this pile like this, it's very easy for them to slide against each other. And when you're only feeding it from the bottom and not the top, it can really easily move and get distorted. So you can see it's sewing through this no problem, because it also just gives it a little bit more kind of force from above, I think, when you're using this kind of foot. So let's have a look at how that now looks. And it is sewn perfectly straight, nothing has moved, and you shouldn't be able to hardly see your seam from the other side. If you haven't pushed all of the pile through that way as you're sewing it, what you can do is, just get a pin and tease it out. But if you push it through as you're sewing, you should end up with something like this where you can barely see the seam at all. So let's have a go now at sewing up this dart. This is going to be the trickiest seam really, because it's the most fiddly. So just going to start it off and then take these clips out as I go. And apologies if my fingers get in the way, but it's hard to kind of do this without getting my fingers in the way. So I'm just going to use a pin just to kind of hold this in place as well. And I'm just going to sew really slowly to make sure this stays perfectly lined up. And if you notice when you're sewing it that it goes off slightly, don't finish it and think you'll unpick it. Just stop straight away and unpick anything that isn't right and then reline it up and do it again. So this is the nice straightforward bit at the beginning, because I'm just lining up with the 1 centimetre part here on my sewing machine. And I can do that all the way up to here, which is the bit where I cut it. And then now I've got to this bit here, put the needle down, let's get rid of some of these clips. Now what I need to do is I just need to kind of use my judgment and visually in my head draw a line where it needs to go so that I stop perfectly in that position. So let's see if I can get this right, doing it by eye. It's only a short distance, so it shouldn't be a problem. And there we go, I've got to the end, and then I'm just going to do a couple of reverse stitches, and that's the first dart sewn up. So you can see that just sewing that little bit there without any kind of guideline, you can just visually do that. So I'll get the other one sewn up and then we can have a look how these look. And that's it. That's the fiddliest bit of sewing done, getting those darts done. And I hope you can't see them because it just shows how good it is when you're using fur that everything is so hidden. So this bit should just naturally open up like this, and this is why I did a 1 centimetre seam allowance everywhere, because that's a nice small amount so that you don't have bulk. You can trim some of this pile off as well if you want to, but I don't go crazy doing that really, because there's not a huge amount. It depends how long your fur is. If you've got a really long fur, then you probably do want to do that. So you've got this kind of little ridge where this bit of dart is here, so you could cut up there a little bit more, but to be honest, I don't want to weaken that, and it's not really that bulky, and it's not going to make a huge amount of difference if I trim it. So that is the dart now done. I'm really pleased to have got that first bit of sewing done and to have had a look with the walking foot and know that it sews this fur really well. So let's start actually assembling the coat. So the first thing I'm going to do is my side seams. So I just need to put right sides together. So all I'm going to do is, let's see if I can zoom out a bit. All I'm going to do is clip both side seams and just get those sewn up exactly the same technique with my walking foot, with my 1 centimetre seam allowance, and that will be the sides done. And I need to do exactly the same on the shoulders. So I'm going to take my time clipping this and pushing all of that pile through. Just make sure when you get to the dart that you have it open like that. You don't want both pieces going to one side. And then all I'm going to do is line this up at the bottom as well. And clip that. And then I can just do all the ones in between. So I'm going to take my time clipping this so that I know I've got it lined up perfectly and I've got as much of the pile pushed through to the right side as possible. So I'll finish that in a second, but I'll just show you as well. So basically I need to do both sides like that, and I need to do my shoulders. So on the shoulders, it should be a bit easier to clip because your pile naturally goes down anyway. So it should just naturally get out of your way. So I'm just lining that up, both sides, just a standard shoulder seam, lining that up, and then I'll do all the ones in between. So I'll get all of this clipped up now, and then we can have a look before I sew that up. So that's all now clipped up, ready to sew. So I'm just going to get all 4 seams done. I'm going to take my time using the walking foot 1 centimetre seam allowance, and then I'll show you how this looks when it's sewn up. The great thing about doing a basic fur coat like this is once you do all of the laborious cutting out and all of that, the actual sewing is relatively quick because there's no detail with pockets, all of those things. It's nice and quick. And that's the body part of the coat done already. So you could add some kind of pockets on here if you want to, but I'm not going to because it's quite fiddly when you're doing it on this big bulky fur, and quite often on a coat, the pockets are a real detail, but with this, you're not even gonna really see it. If I just use a little bit here, if I put some kind of little pocket detail on there, it's just gonna blend in anyway. So I'm not gonna do that. So that is the main body bit of the coat done. So I'm gonna put that aside, and we are gonna put the sleeves together. So you should have 2 inners and 2 outers, and you obviously need to make sure you're matching them up with the correct pieces. So make sure you haven't lost your pins where you've marked where the side seam and the shoulder seam goes, or if you've put tacks in there, then you obviously don't need to worry. So obviously make sure you have the correct pieces together. You don't want to be sewing, for example, that bit to there. You want to make sure you've got the two shorter seams together, and then obviously the longer seams on the other side. So all you need to do is right sides together and clip these together. It's kind of hard to do this with all of this pile, and just make sure the point where it lines up at the top is 1 centimetre in. So it might be a bit tricky to see with this fur, so if you put a pin in one side and then on the other side, just put the pin through where it should come out, and that will help you line that up perfectly. And I'm not going to actually pin the fabric, but I'm just doing that to get it perfectly lined up, and then clip it. And then I can take that out. The bottom is going to be straightforward because obviously it lines up exactly at the hem, so I can clip that. And now I can just clip everything else in between, and I obviously just need to do exactly the same on the other side. So this side goes up to quite a point, so if in doubt, just put your pattern piece back on it. But a 1 centimetre seam allowance means that at the point where it measures 2 centimetres is where the top of that goes. And then I can just do it by eye on this side. That's where my seam line is. I need to just pull all of that pile out of the way, and then I can just do exactly the same and clip that bit at the top. The bottom is, again, very straightforward. And now I can just clip all of that in between, and I'll do that on both sleeves. So I wanted to see how it looks because I've been very eager to see how this is going to look when it's all put together. So my sleeves are sewn up, my body's sewn up, and I just thought I would put the collar on as well, just to see how it looks. So there we go. So you can either put the collar on first and then the sleeves, or vice versa. It doesn't really matter which way around you do it, but as I haven't assembled the collar yet, I'm just going to get the sleeves in. So let's have a look at those one at a time. So you need to have your sleeve the right way round, not inside out. And obviously make sure you have got the correct sleeve on the correct side. And this should be nice and easy to match up. You've got a pin on the inside of the sleeve here that lines up to the side seam on the body. And you've got one at the top that lines up to the shoulder. And then the pins on the armhole, you've got one at the back that lines up to this seam and one on the front that lines up to this seam. So this should be nice and straightforward. So I'm going to go through to the inside, and I'm going to stick pins through to get them in the right positions like I did before. So through this side seam, and then through where the pin is on the inner armhole. And now that's in position, I can take that pin out of my sleeve, and I'm going to put a little clip on either side of this. I'm not going to worry too much about the pile at the moment. I just want to get it in the right place. And now I can take that one out. And then I'm going to go to the shoulder. And I'm just going to do exactly the same. Pin through the seam. Pin through the top of the sleeve. And then I can take that one out. And then a little clip either side. So that's the top of the sleeve and the bottom put in, and now I just need to match these up. So working from the armhole side, I'm just going to use this pin here, and on the sleeve it needs to go through where the seam is, but it needs to go through where the seam is 1 centimetre from the edge. So it's kind of hard to see with so much going on, but basically you want that pin to come out in the middle of that seam 1 centimetre in from the cut edge, or whatever seam allowance you're using. I've got a lot of fluff going on here, so it's hard to see, but I am just doing exactly the same thing. I'll try and tuck that in there and just clipping that either side, and take that one out. And then I just need to do exactly the same on the back. I won't make you watch me do this one as well. And that's now all 4 bits put in where I have notches and seams to line things up with. And then the bottom pieces, because there's no ease in those, they should just clip together really easily. So I'll just do that on either side, nice and quick. You've got such a small amount on the front that you probably will only need one clip. Obviously, if you're using a one-piece sleeve, you will have to put this in slightly differently because you won't have the same lining up points, but it's the same principle. Got fluff going everywhere now. And now what I need to do is I need to ease this on. So depending on how much ease you've got in your sleeve head to go on here, you might need to do a running stitch, or you might be able to just ease this on without it. So I'm going to see how easily this goes on, but let's just have a look. And that has eased on really easily. If you're used to making coats, then generally you'll be used to doing a running stitch to kind of gather this on. But because there is so much give in this fabric, it's not essential. You can still do it if you're struggling to get it on, but you can see by mine that I really don't need to. It's eased on really well. But just make sure you ease the bigger side onto the small side and you don't stretch the small side to fit the big side. So that's that side done. I need to do the same with this other side. And if I just turn it around to see it, you can see that that sleeve head looks perfect. So that's now clipped all the way around. So I'm going to get this sewn on. I don't have enough clips to do both sleeves in one go. So I'll get that sewn on 1 centimetre from the edge, and then I'm going to do the other sleeve exactly the same, and then we can have a look at this all put together. So that's all now sewn up. So that's basically the body of the whole coat. And just make sure when you've sewn your sleeves on that you have maintained the seam allowance, and if any of it slipped at all, then just unpick it and redo that bit. But this is where you should now be up to. So just really take your time putting those sleeves in. It was kind of fiddly with so many clips all around here, but if you sew it slowly, you'll be absolutely fine.
I feel like I'm getting somewhere now. The fur's all put together for the main body and the sleeves. I'm just going to do exactly the same with the lining, and this is going to be so easy in comparison. So I'm not going to make you watch me sew all my lining up because it's exactly the same. If you need to rewind the video just to go through it again in order, do that. But you just need to make exactly the same for the inner layer.
So that's the lining now all sewn up. It's obviously exactly the same as the fur layer that you saw me make. So the next thing I need to do before I start assembling anything and doing my collar and all of that is just putting my inside pocket in. So all I'm doing is, it's just very basic. This is folded over and it measures 12 centimetres by 11 centimetres. And all I'm going to do initially is just stitch up either side. I've just allowed 0.5 centimetre for doing that. So I'll get that sewn up first. And now that that is sewn up, I'm just going to turn it the right way round. And this is going to be really simple just to sew on as a pocket. And because I've done it double layer like that, it means that the raw edges are enclosed in there and you don't have to worry about finishing them off. So I'm just going to go and give this a little bit of a press before I do the next step. So that's now had a good press, and all I'm going to do now is just turn the top over twice like this and just stitch that down, and then it's ready to sew on. So this is now ready to sew in. I know it's only basic, but I wanted to keep this project nice and simple, and I just need to work out where it's going to go. So this is my left side. I'm right-handed, so it just makes sense for me to do it that side, for me to put my hand in it. And it's only small, but this is just for if I am going out and I don't take a bag, I want something to at least put a key in, something like that. So you want to make sure it's high enough from the hem that it doesn't interfere with that. And obviously you don't want it too close to the centre. So just work out where you want to put it, and then literally all I need to do is just sew this on. So you can do a more complicated pocket if you want, but I didn't want to overcomplicate the video, or you can just not do any kind of pocket at all. If you want to add a pocket into the fur layer, then I would suggest, if you want to keep it simple, just doing an inseam pocket on the side seam on the fur layer. And I do have a link to a video doing that in the description. So I'm just going to go and get this sewn on. I'm going to quickly put it on first and make sure it feels like it's in the right place, and that's the lining complete. So now that my little pocket's on, just big enough for a key or a credit card or something like that, I can put this aside.
So now we can do the more fun bit. We can do the collar. And what I would recommend, if you haven't already made a sample of your collar, just test it out to make sure you're happy with the fit and the size and all of that. But I'm going to show you now how to put this collar together, and then of course how to attach it to your coat.
So I've already got my backing fabric on here. I'm not going to put any extra backing on my lining. All I'm going to do is just put the right sides together, and I just need to get this sewn on all the way around. So it's going to take me a while to clip this together, so I won't make you watch me do that. But I'm going to start off in the corner here. I'm going to do this edge here, and I'll do the same on the other side. And then all I need to do is just make sure I pin this on nice and evenly all the way around. So if you've cut the pile correctly, it should go towards the bottom. So you are going to have a bit of overhang, and you want to keep that. You don't want that getting tucked in. So when you are clipping around this back edge here, just make sure you push all that pile upwards before you clip it. And it makes it obviously easier to sew as well because you've got a decent edge. So I'm going to do that all the way around, making sure it's even. I'm not going to do this side because I'm going to be turning it around using that edge there, because that edge is going to be joined onto the neck on the coat. So I will show you how this looks once I've got it all clipped and ready to sew. So that's all now clipped on all the way around, and I just need to get this sewn on. So I've got my right sides together, and this is what I said about this pile going down. It's more tricky, and I don't want to end up with loads and loads of clips because it gets really clunky on the sewing machine. So all I'm going to do, the reason I've got this unpicker in my hand, is as I sew, I'm just going to use my unpicker, and I'm just going to take my time sewing around it, and I'm just going to kind of tuck it in as I go. So it's going to take me a while to sew around, but it means I'm going to have a really nice edge at the bottom. So I've got satin going against the fur, so there could be plenty of slippage as well. So just be careful of that. You can always put pins in going across. If you want to, you could do that as you're sewing or before you start sewing. But just have a think about what fabric you've got, how much slipping you're likely to have, if you've got a walking foot or not, and just take your time sewing all around the edge. So I'm going to sew down the ends and all around here. And the other thing I forgot to say was, because we trimmed a little bit off this outer edge on the lining, it means that the length here is very slightly shorter. There's only 0.5 centimetre in it, so you should be able to ease that on nice and easily. And then when it folds over like that, when you're wearing it, that is going to be perfect, because your satin or whatever fabric you're using underneath is going to mould to that shape. So this is basically what I'm doing. I've got the clips here. I'll take that one out now because it's going to get in my way. And all I'm doing with my unpicker, or you can just use a pin, but I just find unpickers are a little bit better because they're nice and long and you've got a decent handle, is I'm just tucking that in there, and then I'll just sew up until I've got that tucked in, and I'm just taking my time. It's going to take me a while to get around here, but it doesn't matter. It's worth doing. And now I can take that one out and do the next bit. And that's it. Just working my way around, making sure I'm not sewing over all that pile, so I get a really nice edge. So that's all now sewn on. So just make sure you've maintained the seam allowance, because it's very easy to go off. And now I can turn it around. All I've done at the corners is I've just snipped into them a little bit. So I'm just going to turn it around, and you can see there you can't get that point. But I don't want to trim it too much and then discover I've done something wrong. So I'm just turning it around. Once I know it looks okay, I can just go back and just trim those corners. So that all looks fine. And this is why you need to make sure you don't get this all caught up when you're sewing it, because that looks great. You can't see any of the lining. You've got a really nice edge. It's not like a dead straight line because you've got all the pile caught up. And you know that that is going to sit on the inside because you've got that overhang of all the pile. So what I would normally do if this was a different kind of fabric is I'd give this a good press, but I'm not putting my iron anywhere near this fur, so I am going to just leave it at that. You can try and iron it with a pressing cloth or something if you want to, but I don't really feel the need to do that. All I'm going to do is just kind of smooth it down with my fingers and get the best kind of finish that I can. You could do some understitching as well, but I feel like that's going to be very bulky to go through there. And also, if this flaps up, I quite like this little hint of gold, but I don't want to see stitching. So that's how I'm doing it, but it's up to you how you do yours. And obviously, if you've done 2 layers of fur, it will be slightly different. And you can see once that comes up there, when it's going to join that bit, it's hard to probably see in the video, but you can feel this, that this side here is slightly smaller and I've got excess there, and then obviously when it folds over it's gonna fit perfectly. If I just fold that like that, you can see now that sits really nice and flat. There's no bunching up. So that is why I did it the way I did. So all I'm going to do now, I know that's okay, is just turn it back inside out, and I'll trim a little bit closer, and I'm just going to do a little bit at a time until I can get this turned out nicely. I don't want it to go to a super pointy point. That's a bit of a weird way of saying it, I suppose, but I don't want it to go too pointy, but I want it to look like a nice collar shape. So that looks pretty good to me. I'm going to turn it around, just cut a tiny bit off because I can feel a little bit of a knobble, but I'm pretty much there. And it's not always about how much you go to at the point, but it's this bit here, because obviously I've got all of that and all of that turning into this little space. So I'm just going to trim off a little bit at a time. I'm going to tease out any fluff that I don't need, that's no longer attached. And let's just take a little bit more off there. Let's see now how that looks. It helps if you've got something you can just put in there to help get that point out. So anything pointy, I tend to just use the end of my scissors. You can get little gadgets for doing it, but you really don't need to buy a special gadget just for turning out a collar. So the last bit there is the bit I am struggling with, because I've obviously got this thin satin layer and then this really bulky fur. So I'm just going to use a pin to just try and just ease that out a little bit more. But I'm not going to worry too much, because as I said, from that side, that looks really nice. I'm never going to get that to a perfect point on that bit there. I think that's good enough. I really like the shape of that collar, so I'm just going to do exactly the same on the other side. Now that I've got that done, all I'm going to do is I'm going to join the layers here. I'm not going to sew this on the sewing machine because I don't want to sew straight onto that fur. So all I'm going to do is I'm just going to use some pins. I'm going to fold that one quite carefully because I want to make sure that's folded exactly on that seam at the edge. And I'm just pinning it through from this side. You don't need to go all the way through the fur, as long as you just catch that. And then I'm just going to pin this all the way around, so I can basically just put some hand sewing around the edge to hold that in place before I join it onto the body. So I'm kind of doing one from each side to make sure it's nice and even, rather than starting on one side and going round to the other and then ending up with a bit of excess. And that should mean that both the centre points just meet up. So I'm just finishing that off there. There's a tiny little bit of excess, so I just need to ease that out. Just make sure that when it lays flat, your lining isn't twisting to one side. If in doubt, you can mark the centre points from your pattern, but it should be nice and straightforward just to ease that on like that. So all I'm going to do now is I'm just going to do a running stitch to hold it in place, because I need to get this sewn on and I don't want anything moving as I do it. So I've got a 1 centimetre seam allowance, so I'm just going to make sure where I sew this is within that seam allowance on the edge. You can do it on the machine if you want to, but to be honest, it's probably just as quick to do it like this. And I don't really want to be sewing straight onto this fur, because it's going to be really hard to see it, or it could get caught up, whereas actually just doing this, going through the lining and just catching the backing kind of knitted bit of this fur is all I need to do. I don't need to sew all the way through. So I'm just going to get that sewn on all the way around. So my collar is now all sewn up. I've just hand stitched that, and then I've put this tailor's tack here at the centre back point. So literally I've just folded it over and marked that, and then I've done exactly the same on the back neck of my coat. So I need to mark where the edge of the collar goes. So looking back at the pattern, I put a 2 centimetre overlap here. So this is my centre front line here, and that's where the collar joins on. And then of course I've got a seam allowance as well. So I need to take this 2 centimetres plus my seam allowance, so 3 centimetres, and that is the position from the centre front cut edge here where my collar needs to join on. So I'm just going to mark that on both sides. So I've now got a tack on either side where the edge of the collar goes and the centre back, and then on my collar I've got it on the centre back there. So I need to join this on. So the way it's going to be attached is I'm going to join it on to the body of the fur layer. And then afterwards, I'm going to put my lining in and finish this all off around the neck. Now, I'm not going to have a facing on this. If I was making a wool coat, then I'd potentially put a little bit of a facing on the inside. But I don't want this fur on the inside. It's going to get really bulky. I've already got one layer here, another layer here. I don't want a third layer. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get this tacked on by hand first. There are 2 layers of fur plus this layer of satin plus 2 lots of interfacing. So if I just try and pin this and sew it on the machine, I don't want it to slip. I'm going to get it tacked on. So I'm basically lining up this edge. So if you look at where the lining edge is here, you can see a really clear line, and that needs to line up with this tack here. If you've done fur on the inside, it's going to be a bit harder to see, but you just basically need to line that edge up there. So I'm just going to join that for now with a clip. And I'm going to do exactly the same on this side. And then I need to just line up both of these centre back tacks. I'm going to just make sure all that pile goes under there. So they are now lined up. I'm not going to worry about sewing over any of these tacks because I can really easily take them out after. So this should fit on really easily. I've got the centre back, I've got both sides. I need to just clip this in between, and then what I'll do is I'm going to sew it on with a very loose basting stitch that I can really easily unpick. But to make sure this is nice and easy to sew, rather than having all these clips on it or risking anything from slipping, I'm going to get this tacked on really well. So on the body layer, I just need to make sure that all of that pile gets tucked in there. I don't want any of that coming out through my seam. And then this pile is obviously on the outside. That's nice and easy to move out of the way. So I'll get this fully clipped on all the way around, and then I'll show you what kind of stitch I'm going to use to sew it on initially. So that's all now clipped on, ready to go, and I am going to just sew this on to avoid any slipping. So I'm going to start on this side, and I am just literally just going to do a really big stitch. You don't have to worry about what it looks like. You just need to make sure that nothing slips as you're doing it, and you don't have to worry about where it is in relation to the stitch line massively. These stitches are going to come out nice and easily. Use a contrast thread like this so you can see them, but just sew it roughly where you're going to be sewing. So my seam is 1 centimetre from the edge. I'm sewing it around 1 centimetre, but you can see from how I've done it, it doesn't matter if I go off very slightly. The main thing is that this is attached really well so that I can sew through it without having to worry about any clips or pins in the way. I don't have to worry about anything slipping. It's just serving its purpose for a couple of minutes while I get this sewn up. It's going off a little bit because I can't see very well with all this fur where that's going in on that side, but it really doesn't matter. Just get that sewn on nice and securely. I've got that now sewn on, only roughly, but it is sewn on enough so that when I sew this on the sewing machine, which is going to be, it's quite thick to go through. It's not going to be the easiest. It just means it's all held in place. I'm just going to use this, and with my walking foot and taking it slowly, I'm going to get this stitched on. So of all the sewing bits, I think this is the bit that it's not so much fiddly, but it's the thickest and kind of trickiest bit to sew. It's not difficult. I think you just need to take your time. So all I am doing is basically lining it up with the 1 centimetre point here. And what you might want to do actually is where that 1 centimetre point is there, just work out where on your foot it needs to go, because it's going to be a little bit easier to see. And I am just got to put that in the fully raised position. I'm just lining it up with this edge, and this is why I didn't want any clips or pins on here, because it's just more stuff getting in the way and preventing me from seeing it. So I can see from the bottom there it's lined up. I'm lowering that foot, and I can see now that it needs to line up with this point here. And that's basically it. I just need to take my time and just sew this on. So I'll start with a couple of reverse stitches, and as I'm sewing, I've already got the underneath layer kind of pulled down. I just want to be pulling this pile down, and if in doubt, just hand wind this so you can do it really slowly, but it will sew no problem through those layers, because as much as it's really thick, it's actually really soft, this fur. It's just bulky. So let's just see how this goes. I'll just start it off. I won't make you watch the whole thing because it's going to take me a while. So I'm just going to do a couple of reverse stitches as well, just to make sure that's in place. I think that's slipped a tiny bit. And I've got this on a 3.5 stitch length. You could do this on the longest stitch you've got first and then go back over it if you want to. But as long as you take it nice and slowly like this, I hope my hand hasn't been in the way. I've just noticed my hand was in the way. So just take your time, keep it lined up, keep that fur out of the way. And if you've tacked it on well, then this will all stay in the right place. Use your unpicker or a pin if you want to just kind of make sure all of that fluff is out of the way. And you can always unpick a bit of this and re-sew it if you find that you go off of where your seam is. So I'm going to get that sewn on all the way around. So that's all sewn on now. I can see a little bit here where I've gone off very slightly from my 1 centimetre, so I need to restitch that. But I'm going to be putting the lining in now, so I'm going to be sewing around here again, so I can just do it while I'm doing that. So that is the collar on now. I tried it on to make sure it all looks great.
Now we're ready just to put the lining in. We are so close to being finished. So you don't have to put it in the same order as I do, but I just find this is the easiest way. So I sew it together around the neck first, then I do the cuffs, then I do the centre front, and then finally the hem. There's various ways of doing this, but I think this is the easiest way to get a good finish.
So the lining needs to be attached all the way around. So let's turn this the right way round. So basically it looks inside out because, I think I better zoom out here a little bit, hadn't I? So your sleeves are going to go inside the other sleeves. And that means that you have the nice side of your lining against your body. And this is basically going to be sewn all the way around the neck, down the centre front, around the hem here, and the cuffs. So you need to get this sewn in at all those points. The first thing I need to do is I need to put the right sides together on the neck. So you can put some interfacing or something in your lining if you want to, but I don't think you really need to. I've got so many layers in this. I want to keep my lining nice and simple. So let's just turn that around. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to clip at the centre front here. And you can tack this first like we did the other bits if you want to as well, but the collar's now attached and I never find at this stage that it's quite as tricky. So I'm just lining up the shoulder seam. If you want to mark the centre back you can, but that back neck isn't particularly big, so if you've got the shoulders lined up that should be nice and straightforward. And then I'm just going to do the opposite centre front. And now all I need to do is just fill in all the bits in between. Just make sure your collar is stitched down nicely on the ends. You don't want that poking up. And you've got quite a few layers to sew through here, but the bits around the cuffs, the centre front and the bottom are going to be a lot easier. So that is one side done. I'll just quickly clip this other side. So that's the neck all now clipped on ready. So that's how it's going to look. And it's so nice when you start seeing all of those raw edges enclosed. So once I've got that stitched on, this bit is then finished. What I didn't do yet is take out all of that tacking. So if you want to take that tacking out before you sew it, you can do that. But to be honest, if the tacking is within the seam allowance, you can just leave it in. So I am going to get that sewn on now, and I am really going to take my time to get this perfect. I nearly forgot something really important, which is my hanging loop. So I'm just using a bit of ribbon and I'm just going to fold it like this and stitch it in. So I need to stitch it in before I attach the lining. So all I'm going to do, I can leave those clips in place. I'm only hand sewing this in. I'll just take those few out there. And all I need to do, I can either attach it to this layer or this layer, but I'm going to attach it to my lining just because it's that little bit easier to sew on. So I can see where the centre is because I've got the fold line from where this fabric was folded when I bought it that I haven't managed to completely press out. And all I'm going to do is just attach it either side of this. So I'm going to put a little fold in there and fold it up the other side and just make sure it's long enough for hanging it up. You can obviously use whatever you like, but I always like using a funky ribbon like this. So that's where my stitch line is going to be there. That's the size of my loop. It's probably a little bit long. I'm just going to shorten it very slightly. So all I need to do is just quickly hand stitch this on, and then I can clip all of this back together. Can't get to the inside now. once it's hand stitched on, I can just clip that again and just sew that on. I am hopeless at hanging loops. I always forget to do them. I get my lining sewn in and then I have to unpick this little bit. For some reason, I just have a mental block on hanging loops and forget them. So just get that sewn in at this stage if you want to put a loop in. So that's all sewn on now. I've got my loop in there, and what I did when I sewed across this bit, I just went backwards and forwards a couple of times, so that's nice and strong. So once that's on, just go back into the inside and just double check that you have maintained your seam allowance all the way from the edge. It is so easy to go off. I've gone off in a couple of places and I'm just going to go back and correct that before I move on to the next step. I'm not going to do any trimming on this because I've only got 1 centimetre seam allowance and I don't really want to be trimming this fabric down any more than that. So just make sure yours sits nicely around the curves, and if it doesn't, just do a little bit of trimming on the inside on this seam. If you've done a bigger seam allowance than me, then you are going to need to do a little bit of trimming. Just snip into it kind of this way, and that will help it sit better around those curves. But if your seam allowance is nice and small, then that should sit absolutely fine. So that's that done. We now need to do the cuffs. So you need to make sure you get this done right. So let's see if I can zoom out a little bit. There we go. So what you want is your sleeve like this, so you see all the raw edges. And then the easiest way, I think, is just put your hand in it and just thread it through the sleeve of the outer. And you need to make sure it's not got twisted as you've put it in. And then when you get your cuff at the bottom, line up these seams so that you've got them together. So if they don't line up like this, you know you've got it twisted because you've got 2 different sizes and they need to line up properly. You could have twisted it a whole turnaround, but it's unlikely. But just make sure by putting your arm in, that's not twisted. And then what we need to do is we need to sew around here. So let's just get that in position again. That's just moved a little bit. So what I'm going to do is I am just going to put a pin through that bit there. And then I can bring it through. So you're literally just having to just join both layers on one of the seams, doesn't matter which one. And then what I need to do is I need to pull this through. So I want to make sure you can actually see what I'm doing. So you've got your sleeve put into the other sleeve and then just pull it through. Just make sure you don't knock that pin out along the way. And this is now what I need to join. So there we go. That's what we saw from the outside, but obviously we don't want to join it like that. We want right sides together. So all I'm going to do is just flip that over so it's exactly the same position that I've pinned, but it's right sides together. And the reason I do it this long-winded way is because if you don't, you've got no idea if you've got this all twisted. It's just a kind of foolproof way of doing it. So doing the cuffs is going to be a bit more tricky with the pile because you've got all of your pile overhanging this here. So basically where you're sewing is against that edge and you can't see that edge. Don't trim all that fluff off because you want all of that to be overhanging. You could trim a little bit off the very bottom, but you don't want to trim too much because you want your fur to overhang at the bottom. So I've tucked it in like that. And all I'm going to do is put a little clip in there. And now that's nice and securely fixed. I'm going to just trim a little bit of the fluff off from where the seam is here, just so that's a bit easier to see. And then I'm just going to do exactly the same on this side and put the clip in there. And now I can take that pin out. So I need to just do this all the way around. So the best way, I always think, is to get that first one done and then work your way around to the other seam and do exactly the same. So I'll do like I did before and just trim a bit of that fluff off there so I can see the seam better. And then I'm just putting a pin through the seam, through that seam, and then I'm just doing exactly the same again, either side with a clip to hold that in place. And that's that one now fixed on. So I can just go around now and fill in the gaps either side and clip that all the way around, making sure I've got all of that pile tucked in. So I'll get that done and I'll show you how it looks. And there we go, that's all clipped on. So it just goes the whole way around, and I just need to sew this the same as I've been sewing the rest, 1 centimetre from the edge, and I will take my time doing that, and I'm going to use my unpicker as I go around, just making sure that that is all tucked in. If you don't want to do it with all these clips on, doing this kind of fiddly cuff, you can always just tack it first, and then it just means that you don't have all of these in the way. But I'm just going to get that sewn on, and then I will show you how it looks. And that's now all sewn on. It was a little bit fiddly, but it wasn't too bad. So I'll show you how that now looks. I need to just go to the right side and pull this through, and assuming that I didn't get that twisted when I put it on, that should all now be in perfectly. So the test is if I put my arm in and I don't feel any twists in that, and that's perfect, and I get this nice finish on my cuff. So you could do a bit of understitching in there to hold it in place, but you really don't need to. I'm gonna now just get the other cuff done before we move on to the next part. The cuffs are done, it's done around the neck. The next bit I'm gonna do is down the front here, and this is the much easier bit to do. You're going with the pile if you're sewing from top to bottom and you don't have any pile sticking out of the bottom. It is nice and straightforward. I'm literally just going to clip these together. I'm going to make sure, I don't want that going in there, but I'm going to make sure all of that pile is going inside my seam. And I just need to clip all the way down to the bottom and get that sewn up. It's a little bit easier to clip it if you put your fur underneath and your lining on the top. I just find it easier anyway. So I'm just going to take my time now, just making sure I've got all that tucked in really well, because if I can get it tucked in now, I know when I sew it, it's going to be that little bit easier. So I just need to carry on doing that. I'm going to put plenty in, because the more I put in, the more it's going to keep that pile out of the way for when I sew. So I'll just get that done all the way down to the hem. So that's all clipped and ready to sew. So normally I would have the fur underneath and the lining on top. I always like my thicker fabric underneath, but you want to be sewing with the pile. You want to be sewing from top to bottom. So just for this piece, I'm going to sew with the lining underneath. So I'm going to have to be extra careful to not let anything slip as I sew down here. And again, I'm going to use my unpicker just to tuck all of these bits in. So I'll just get that sewn down there, and then on the other side, my lining is going to be on the top, so it's going to be a lot easier to sew down. So I'll get both of the centre fronts now sewn up. That's both of the centre fronts now done, and all I need to do is a little bit of trimming on the inside here. So basically on this little bit where you've got this corner, you're not going to be able to turn this around very well with all of this seam allowance here. So just be careful and trim a little bit off. You don't want to trim off any more than you need to. So a bit like when I did the collar, you just, I don't know where that's gone now. I want to make sure it doesn't go between the layers. There we go. You just want to trim off enough that when you turn that around, you're going to get a nice corner. So let's see how that looks. It's a bit easier than the collar because it's not such an angle, and that's how you want it to look. It just pulls out a lot easier. That's the side I haven't done yet. So that's all you need to do. Just do that on both sides, and then we can move on to the hem. So I've got quite a bit of fluff that has come through to the inside, and I don't want that. All I'm going to do is just use a pin or an unpicker, and you just need to go around that seam, and any of that fluff that's gone to the inside that you don't want on the inside, just pull it through. It takes a little bit of time. You don't have to do this, but I just don't want to lose any of the fur that I've got to sit on the inside. So I'm just going to go all the way down here, making sure I haven't got too much caught up, and then that is the centre front edges done. So the last bit to join is this bottom edge, and a bit like the cuffs, it's tricky because you've got this overhang, but it's nice and easy to get to. So I'm just going to do the fronts first. So I'm just going to do it like this up to the side seam. So all I need to do, exactly the same as how I did my cuffs, is just tuck the fur in and clip it, and I'm just going to work all the way along to the side seam doing that, and it should line up absolutely perfectly because both of these are the same size. What I tend to do is get that side seam position put in first, so just a pin through that seam and then through this one as well, and then like I've been doing before, just put a clip either side. I've got a lot of fluff on this seam here, so like I did before, just going to trim that off so I can see what I'm doing, and then I can get that one in that side, take the pin out, and now all I need to do is just fill all of these in, and I'll do exactly the same on the other side as well. So that's the first side clipped on. I'm going to just tuck this fur in as I go along, and I'm going to get that sewn up from the front edge there to my side seam, and then I can just trim this exactly the same as I did at the top, and I'll do exactly the same on the other side. Now that that's done, the last bit to do is just finish this at the bottom. So what I'm going to do, and you can leave this open when you're sewing the lining up initially if you want to, is I'm going to unpick a little bit here, and that means I'm going to be able to stitch the whole of this in exactly the same way as this, and then just sew that up afterwards. So all I'm going to do, in fact it's better to go to the inside to do this, but the reason I like to get it sewn up and then just unpick it after is because you just know everything's put together exactly right, and this seam is pressed, which makes it a little bit easier to hand sew up at the end. And if you don't want to hand sew it up, you can just sew it on the machine on the outside like that, just very close to the edge. And you will notice this on a lot of shop bought coats. So I just need that to be big enough that I can access all of that seam through it. So I don't want to unpick the whole seam, just want to unpick part of it. So now that I've done that, I can basically, going through this little access bit here, I can sew the whole of this bottom edge here through my little opening. But I'm not going to clip it all together like that. I want to get it clipped up as much as I can like this, just so I know that it's nice and even. So initially, all I'm going to do is just pull that nice and flat, and I'm just going to get that centre point there pinned, because you've got quite a long length here to get on. I'm just going to pin it in a couple of places in between. I'm only going through the backing fabric of the fur. So that's kind of held it all in place. And now I can go through to the inside, knowing that this is all in the right position. And I can just gradually replace those pins for clips with the right sides together. So I'm going to take one of these pins out because I can't quite get to it. I've put a few too many in. So let's just take that one out. And then all I need to do here is just clip this together, making sure it's nice and even from either side. And that looks pretty good there. So I'll get a couple of clips in. And then I can take the next pin out, and I'm basically just going to work my way along. I'm now just going to carry on clipping all of this from this side. I'm just going to do it quite rough initially, because once I've done that, I can just turn this the right way around and just make sure that it's still nice and even. It's very easy to accidentally go off on this. So I'll get all of this clipped on all the way along, and then show you how it looks. And that's how it looks when it's turned around. I've still got all the clips in, I haven't sewn it yet, but I just wanted to make sure that nothing had slipped. So all I'm going to do now is just go back through my little access hole, and I can clip this on a lot more precisely with all of the pile tucked in, ready to sew. So I'm going to put plenty of clips on there and just work my way along. I tend to go with the little bits in between the existing clips, get those put on, and then I can take out that one and I can tuck all that fluff in there, and I'll just carry on the whole way along and get this stitched on. So I've now got plenty of clips on there. I can get that all sewn up and then just finish off that bit on the inside. And that's the bottom edge now done. So all I've got left to do is just sew this back up. So I can actually do part of this just on the machine, just putting the seam back how it was. So all I'm going to do is just pin exactly where I originally sewed it, and I will get that sewn from the inside as much as I can, and then I will just sew it on the outside for that last little bit. You'll be left with just a tiny little bit that you can't do. You can either machine it or hand sew it, but that's the lining now basically in. Once I've sewn that up, I've just got to put my little hooks on, and that's now sewn up. So all I've got is literally from here to here just sewn on the outside. I always just find that that's a bit more secure than hand sewing it, and it actually looks neater, and no one is ever going to see that. So that is, let's zoom out a little bit, that is the coat now put together. I am so happy with it. Can't wait to put it on, but the last thing I need to do is get my hooks on.
And of course, no coat is going to be complete without something to do it up. So I've not put any buttons on here. Buttonholes on this would be a nightmare. You could put buttons and loops if you wanted to, but fur hooks are fantastic. I have made fur coats in the past where I've then just sewn decorative buttons over the top, but I wanted to keep this one just nice and simple because this fur, it kind of does all the talking. You don't need any more detail. It's such a fantastic fur. It's called Marmot. I don't know if Marmot's fur is exactly like this, but this is what it's called. So what I've used here, if I can undo this, I'm glad to undo it because I'm getting pretty hot wearing this, is I've got these big fur hooks. So they're basically big hook and eyes, and they're coated in some kind of cord, and they are fantastic for fur. Obviously this side you're not going to see, but on this side, I don't know how well you can see them in the video, but they just get hidden amongst the fur. So you just have this little bit. It would be great if I could get these in the right colour, but they generally just come in this kind of creamy colour, and I think black, white, grey, those kind of colours, but you can hardly see the bits where I've sewn it on. I've made sure I've got all the fluff around that to keep it nice and hidden. So I'll show you now what these hooks look like close up, and also how to sew them on.
So these are fur hooks. If you've not seen them before, they're hook and eyes. Should have opened this packet before I started, shouldn't I? And they're kind of covered in this, I'm not really sure what it is. It's like a cord that goes around it, and they basically get lost in the fur. So what I need to do is I need this to go over like this, and I'm going to put the hook on this side, and then I'm going to put my eye on this side, and then they can hook up. But what I don't want is for this bit to be seen. So I'm going to put them in a little bit, and you just want all of that to get lost in the fur. So once you've sewn it on, you can kind of pull the fur through those bits. So you now can't really see those. But the other thing is, when that overlaps it there, you're really not going to see it. So I'm going to get these stitched on. I'm just going to put one at the top. I'm going to put one a little way up from the bottom, and then put the other one in between, and then I'll show you how that looks. You just need to sew them on how you would normally do a hook and eye, with a few stitches on there. So the way I do these hooks is I want this not to go all the way to the edge. I want the edge of this to be about a centimetre from the edge here. So I've put a stitch through, and I've tied the end of that, and then I'm just going to put my needle through this so that when I pull it through, it forms a loop. And I want to just loop it around here so it goes around that middle bit. So that's now held in place, and that gives me the ability now just to position it. So I basically want the inside, so if I put my unpicker in there, basically the inside of that, I want it to be a centimetre from this edge. So I want it to go here. So now that I've got that in position, just put a couple of stitches through there. And what you want to do is you want to go through the lining, but you also need to go through the fur. So obviously not the fluffy bit of the fur, but the backing fabric on it, because you want that to be fixed through both layers. You don't want, where it separates like this, you don't want that to happen. You want it to be fixed through both. So make sure you go through both layers there, and just do a few stitches on that bit on the inside, and then you can just work your way around these. And you don't need to do loads of stitches on these. It's not going to have loads of force. It's not a tight coat. So you just need a few stitches to hold that into place. I would do it in the colour to match the hook rather than the lining, but I wanted you to see what I'm doing on this. So that is all you need to do. And then once you've gone around, you just get back to the start again. And then I would just do a couple of stitches all the way down here as well. And that's now nice and securely sewn on. Both of the layers are joined together. Make sure you haven't caught the pile. And all I do is I tend to just put it through like that. And then if you pull it nice and tight and snip it close to the fabric, then your end gets lost within the layers. So that's the first one sewn on. I'm going to do another one. I was playing around with that. That one is a little bit too low. I am going to put it about here. I'm going to quickly try it on and make sure that's a good position. And then all I'll do is just measure those. So that measures 31. So 15.5 is where I can put one there. And I'm just going to position this on here. And I'm just going to hold it up and just see if that's enough. So those 3 should be enough, as it's not a close fitting jacket. If you're doing something more close fitting, I would definitely put more hooks on. But generally, fur coats like this, you don't have them really tight. And that should be enough to hold it together. And then I'll have to put the other halves on here, which I'll show you, which is the trickier bit of it. And then if you want to, you could just sew some buttons on the outside, just as something decorative. So I'll get these other 2 sewn on here, and then I'll show you how to do the other side. So that's my 3 hooks sewn on. Now the trickier thing is to do this side. So hopefully you'll see what I'm doing with this fur. It's kind of hard with all this pile to be able to see it. You're going to lose the pins, but I'll try my hardest for you to see it properly. So line these top 2 up. I'll just show you with the top one. And then you want to be lining up this position here. And I'm just going to put the pin through the fur like that. And then what I need to do is I need to get the exact position. So if I show you on this side, because you can see it a lot better than the fur, what I want is, whereas I measured 1 centimetre from the edge to the inside of the hook there, I've got a 4 centimetre total overlap. I've got 2 centimetres from either side, if you think back to when you did the pattern. So I want this to be 3 centimetres from the inside here to this edge. So that's there. So let's just put a pin to mark that, and then I can put this down. So what I want to do is this position here, I'm going to work my way along over to that. That is where I want my hook. I hope that makes sense. I don't know how else to explain it. So what you don't want to do, ideally you would sew it on that way round so that that bit gets covered up, but it's not going to work. It needs to go this way around. And the reason I measured 3 centimetres to the inside is because that's how it needs to go on, like this. So I need to sew this on, and I want it to be as invisible as possible. So just check that that goes in there, and I want this bit here, this loop, to line up with my pin, and then I'm going to sew this on. So I'm going to use a thread to match the fur, because that's going to help hide it as well. And if you're incredibly patient, you could literally sew over all of that and hide it all with a thread in the same colour as your fur. I don't have quite that much patience. So let's just get this sewn on and see how much we can hide it. So just like when we sewed the hooks on, we want this to go through all of the layers. We want to sew through everything. And once you've got it on like that, just test it out and see how it looks. So you can see that bit, but you can't see loads. So all I'm going to do initially is just get this sewn on, and I'm not going to worry too much about how visible it is. And I only need a few stitches on each side to get that done. But as I said, for every stitch you do, if you can get a good colour match, it actually helps to hide the hook. Nearly done with just getting that firmly attached. So that's on now nice and secure. And already it's getting pretty hidden in that pile. But the other thing we can do, hopefully I can get close enough without it getting blurry, is I can just tease some of the fur out from in the little holes inside the loops, and that's going to help a little bit more, and just tease it out from the side. And once you've worked your whole way around it, you've got this bit on the inside, you've got both sides of this, and make sure, I'm using my picker now because the pin was starting to bend, but just take your time. You might need to use your fingers just to tease it through. But just work your whole way around, work your way around the outside, all around there. And actually, once I do that, I think you'd agree that that is pretty hidden. And then you just have that little bit there to hook it onto. And that is, if I put it like that, that is my finished hook at the top. You would have no idea that that is there. So I've got that first one done. I need to just do the other 2. I'll take my time marking these out. You can see how much better these ones look than this because I've done it in the right colour. And these ones are obviously going to be really hidden. So I'll get the other 2 sewn on and then I am done. I really hope you have enjoyed this tutorial. I have really enjoyed making this one. I'm really happy that I can finally now wear this coat. I've had this fur sitting here for a few days and I've been desperate to make it so I can wear it. But I hope you have learnt plenty along the way, from cutting out the fur, how to sew it up, the walking fur, all of those things. If there's something that I haven't explained very well, do please ask in the comments. I always
answer every question. Even if it's not straight away, I always get back to everyone. And if there's anything else fur related that you would like to see, do please ask. I've got a couple of other tutorials in the planning process at the moment that I should have done over the next couple of weeks. So make sure you subscribe if you haven't already so you don't miss out on that. So if you have enjoyed this, do please like it and do please share it as well with anyone else you know who might like it. I just want to say a massive thank you to everyone who's been supporting me over the last 18 months. I am just loving putting these tutorials together, and I am having comments that are literally making me emotional with the gratitude that people have for my videos. And I also want to say a massive thank you to Sharon, who has been supporting me for a while, and I always see her lovely comments, and she supported me last week by buying me a coffee on buymeacoffee.com, which I've put a link to in the description, which is another way you can support. But just watching and liking my videos is fantastic, and I appreciate every single one of those views and comments and likes. So if you have enjoyed this, do please check out my other tutorials, and there will be in the next couple of weeks a couple of other fur themed tutorials coming up.